arrived early, as I always did. That's just who I've been all my life, the one who shows up first, the one who stays to wash the dishes. When the music fades and the floor is sticky with cake crumbs and footprints, I parked across the street watching their house through the windshield for a few quiet moments. There were already cars in the driveway, and the front lawn had 2 lopsided helium balloons tied to a stake. They bobbed like they were tired of floating, already slouching toward the ground, even though the party hadn't even started. I took a deep breath and checked the seat beside me. The gift bag sat carefully in the passenger seat, neatly folded tissue paper peeking out of the top. I'd wrapped a small silver box inside a locket, with a tiny photograph of my grandson and me when he was just a baby sleeping on my chest. It wasn't expensive. It didn't need to be. It was memory made solid love, pressed into metal. But as I looked up at the house again, I felt something in my chest tighten, like I'd forgotten something, or walked into the wrong story. When I rang the doorbell, I could already hear children's laughter and the clinking of cutlery. The door opened, and there she stood, my daughter-in-law. Her expression didn't change much. She opened the door like a hostess welcoming an unwanted guest at a dinner party, stepping aside, just enough for me to come in, but not so far that it felt like a real invitation. I smiled polite. "Hello, dear," I said, offering a small wave, holding up the gift bag. She nodded without meeting my eyes and turned away, already moving toward the kitchen. Inside, the air smelled of frosting and fried food, but none of it felt warm. There were bright decorations, streamers, and plastic dinosaurs, and a banner that read, "Happy Birthday," in glittery letters, but the space felt like it was missing a heartbeat. It didn't feel like family. Not really. I walked carefully to the counter and set down the gift bag, placing it gently between 2 store-bought party trays. No one said hello. The house was full, but I felt like a ghost walking through it. I passed her mother in the hallway. She didn't say anything either. Her sister, her aunt, a cousin I'd never met, all chatting in a little group around the kitchen island, laughing about something on someone's phone. I offered a quiet, "Good morning," but no one looked up. I might as well have been speaking from behind glass. I thought maybe I'd go find my grandson. He always made everything feel worthwhile. He was in the living room, sitting cross-legged on the carpet, building something with colorful blocks. His little face lit up when he saw me. "Grandma," he shouted, and just like that I felt air rush back into my lungs. I crouched beside him and hugged him tightly, his tiny arms wrapping around my neck, his fingers sticky with icing or juice. I didn't care. That moment alone could have been enough, but when I looked up, I saw her in the doorway again, watching us with a kind of cold calculation, like she was taking notes, like she didn't like what she saw. I stayed by my grandson's side for a while, helping him build a little house out of blocks. I asked him what he wished for his birthday, and he whispered, "More time with you." That almost broke me. But I just smiled and tucked his hair behind his ear. "Me too, sweetheart. Me too." Eventually, people began moving toward the dining area, where a table was crowded with paper plates and half-deflated balloons drooping from the chandelier. My son brushed past me on his way there. He hadn't said hello yet either. I called his name softly. He turned briefly, then looked over his shoulder toward the kitchen as if checking for her. He gave me a short nod. Nothing more. That's when I felt it fully, the shift. The silence that grows not because no one is speaking, but because no one is willing to see you. I'd walked into many rooms in my life, many gatherings, some full of joy and others of sorrow. But I had never felt so entirely invisible at a celebration of someone I love with my whole being. I sat at the end of the table farthest from the cake. They didn't save me a seat close to him. I didn't say anything, just smiled and kept my hands folded. I looked at the decorations, the streamers, the perfectly arranged cupcakes. Everything looked right, but none of it felt right. Even the balloons seemed to sag, with a kind of shared exhaustion, like they too were tired of pretending. That day wasn't the beginning. Not really. I'd seen glimpses of this before, quiet, slight, strained smiles, a missing invitation here and there. But something about that birthday pierced deeper. There was something final about the way I was handled, the way I was tolerated instead of welcomed. I looked at my gift on the counter. No one had touched it, not even a glance. And in that moment, I knew something was unraveling, and I had to choose whether I would keep stitching it back together or let it go. I chose silence, for now. The worst kind of dismissal isn't loud. It's not the slamming of doors or the screaming of insults. It's silence. A silence that doesn't wait for you, doesn't see you, doesn't miss you when you leave. That was the silence my daughter-in-law wrapped herself in, and that's what I felt as I moved quietly through her house that day, like a vase set on a shelf just to say it was there, not because it held anything she valued. She didn't even look at me. Not once. Not when I arrived, not when I hugged her son, not when I handed her my carefully wrapped gift, not when I asked if she needed help with the food. Her eyes always slid past mine, always landed on someone else, something else. I wasn't real to her. I wasn't someone worth engaging. I wasn't part of her world. It wasn't new, of course, but that day it hit differently. That day it felt like a declaration. I remember watching her glide around the kitchen, commanding it like a stage. Every movement was deliberate, opening cabinets, without hesitation shouting cheerful instructions to her mother, her sister, her cousin, laughing too loud at stories that felt curated to exclude me. And I noticed something odd. None of them ever asked me anything. Not how I was doing, not if I needed a drink, not even where I got my shoes. It sounds silly, but the tiniest questions are how we acknowledge someone's humanity. And mine, was a non-topic in that house. I sat down near the kitchen island, close enough to feel like I was trying, but not close enough to intrude. She walked past me twice, not a glance, not a word. My son was helping carry some folding chairs from the garage. I offered to help. He gave me a look, that tight-lipped, slightly worried look, that says, "Please don't start anything." I held my tongue, but I heard the message loud and clear. She didn't want me there. She wanted control. And my son, well, I saw it in the way he moved, like a guest himself in his own home, walking lightly, so as not to rattle her expectations. He smiled too quickly when she spoke. He lowered his voice when he disagreed. I'd raised a strong, kind, expressive man, and here he was, a version of himself that felt shaved down at the edges. Softer, quieter, almost fearful. I watched him pour juice into plastic cups, each movement almost careful enough to be rehearsed. She walked by, glanced at the line of cups, then frowned. "Use the other ones," she said curtly, not even looking at him. He changed them without a word, just nodded. And that broke something in me. Not the moment itself, not the juice, not the cups, but the way he folded, the way his shoulders slumped just barely, the way he didn't even try to defend his choice. It was the kind of small submission that doesn't show up in photographs, but lives in the marrow of a home. I thought back to when he was young. He used to defend me even when I didn't need it. If someone mocked my cooking, he'd glare at them and say it was the best meal he'd ever had. If someone ignored me, he'd pull my chair closer. He was loyal, proud. And now he couldn't even meet my eyes when she was in the room. He'd once told me he married her because she was strong. She doesn't take nonsense from anyone, he'd said with a chuckle. I remember smiling, then thinking it was good that he'd found someone with spirit. I didn't know then that not taking nonsense would slowly morph into not taking family. Later in the afternoon, I stood in the hallway looking at framed photos, all carefully arranged. I counted the ones. I was in 0, not 1. There were baby pictures, vacation snapshots, even candids with her side of the family, her sister holding the baby, her mother at the beach, her cousin in the kitchen. But me. You'd never know I existed. I stared at one photo of them all at Christmas, gathered around the tree. That was the year I hadn't been invited. They said it was just going to be a small thing this year. A small thing I now realized with professional lighting and coordinated pajamas. She passed behind me again. Didn't stop. Didn't even pause. That kind of invisibility wears you down. It starts like mist, barely there, and then it seeps into your joints, your voice, your sense of belonging. I stood there, in their hallway, surrounded by her curated life, and realized I'd become a guest in my own bloodline, a relic they kept around out of politeness, a statue in a museum no one visits anymore. When it came time to light the birthday candles, I stood off to the side. I didn't want to make a scene. I didn't want to be in the way, but I watched. And I saw her put her arm around my son, lean into him, like a queen on her throne, smile, like the house was hers, like the people inside it were hand-picked ornaments in her life. And I understood something I hadn't wanted to admit. She wasn't just excluding me. She was replacing me. One glance at a time, one missing photo, one unspoken invitation. She didn't even need to look at me, that was the point. I've always believed that a kitchen says more about a family than their words ever could. You hear the real things there between the clang of pans and the rustling of napkins. That day I tried to help, out of habit mostly. I asked where the extra forks were. No one answered. I opened a drawer, closed it gently, opened another. Her mother looked at me, then looked away. Her sister glanced at me, and then leaned in closer to whisper something into her mother's ear. They laughed, just softly enough to be cruel. I busied myself with plastic cups. I thought maybe if I stood there long enough, someone might acknowledge my presence. I used to be the kitchen. I used to be the one who made things happen. Birthdays, holidays, every scraped knee and broken heart, I'd baked something for it, brewed tea for it, swept the crumbs of it. But in her house, I was a spare spoon in the wrong drawer. Then I heard it, not loudly, but just enough. She always acts like she's the matriarch. It's exhausting. And her reply chuckled but sharp. She thinks she's still relevant. Bless her heart. I didn't breathe. I didn't turn. I just stared down into the sink where I'd placed a single red cup, its rim smeared with frosting. I knew those voices. I knew the rhythm of that kind of ridicule. It wasn't the first time I'd been whispered about, but it was the first time it came from inside the family I had helped build. I stepped back slowly, as if even the floor might betray me. My hands trembled, so I clutched the edge of the counter, pretending to straighten the paper napkins. I smiled thinly, like I hadn't heard, like I wasn't just called a shadow in my own family's gathering. And still my son didn't notice. He was out back with the children grilling burgers and smiling like everything was whole. He didn't see how they looked at me. He didn't see how they spoke when he wasn't around. I thought about the first time I'd met her. She was pretty ambitious and clever, all the things I had once admired in women who knew how to use their voice. But even then, something sat wrong with me. Not because she was confident, no, I respected that, but because she didn't ask about us, didn't want to know where we came from, what we held sacred. Everything she touched, she wanted to remake in her own image. I remember giving her my mother's pie recipe once, a simple gesture and offerings. Weeks later, I asked if she ever tried it. She laughed casually. "Too sweet," she'd said. I threw it out. That was the first time I realized she wasn't just disinterested in me, she was actively dismissing me. I looked around her kitchen again. White granite, gold accents, designer everything. There wasn't a trace of family history here. No faded tea towels, no dented mugs from childhood, no chipped plates with memory baked into the porcelain. Just pristine things placed for show like a catalog come to life. Her world didn't have room for old things, not even old women who remembered how her husband used to run barefoot through the sprinklers. I moved into the hallway and stood beside the coat rack, suddenly uncertain if I should stay. It wasn't just that I wasn't needed. It was that I was something to be managed, a potential embarrassment, a wrinkle in their smooth facade. A few minutes later, my grandson ran in, his cheeks flushed with laughter, his voice a beam of light. "Grandma, come see my dinosaur cake," he shouted. I followed him, because of course I did. For him, I would always come. He grabbed my hand, sticky fingers lacing through mine. For a moment, I forgot the sharpness of those whispers. I let his joy be louder. But as I stood next to him at the table admiring the cake, she appeared again. She looked at our joined hands, then at me. Her eyes flicked to the camera in her sister's hand. "Let's take some photos," she said brightly. She moved quickly. She positioned her parents, her sister, her cousin. She called over my son. I waited. I stood there smiling foolishly, thinking surely she would say, "Come stand beside him, Mom." But she didn't. I watched the photos happen without me. My grandson smiled through them all unaware. I stepped back into the hallway quietly. The party continued like I didn't. I sat alone on the edge of the couch, surrounded by the echoes of my own thoughts. I realized something I hadn't wanted to admit. They weren't just building a life without me. They were doing it on purpose, and she was leading the charge. I'd spent so many years thinking my love could be enough, that if I showed up, if I smiled, if I gave gifts and offered help and stayed kind, they would see me. They would include me. But you cannot pour tea into a cup that's already been filled with contempt. You cannot matter to people who've already decided your worth was spent. And in that kitchen with those whispers, I felt the truth arrive not like thunder, but like frost. I had been replaced, rewritten and rearranged in the story of my own family, and they thought I wouldn't notice. There's something about parties like that when everything looks cheerful, but underneath it all, there's a quiet hum of something hollow, the kind of cheerfulness that's pressed on like a sticker shiny on the outside, but peeling at the edges. That was the birthday party. That was the room I sat in, surrounded by bright colors and brittle laughter. Everything looked perfect. But I felt like I was seated on the edge of a stage where I didn't belong, waiting for a cue that would never come. The dining table was covered in themed decorations, little dinosaur hats, neon green napkins, paper plates, with cartoon teeth. The cake had 5 layers, all different colors. I'll admit it was impressive. She always had a way of organizing things, so they looked like they belonged in a magazine. But no matter how elaborate the decorations, they couldn't cover up the way she made people feel small. I took a seat near the end of the table again. No one asked me to move closer. No one offered me a better chair. Her mother was already seated beside my son, laughing about some school event I'd never heard of. Her sister snapped pictures of the birthday cake from every angle, and when the kids were finally called in to sing, I clapped along my voice, joining the chorus, but somehow still unheard. I glanced around the room. Not one person made eye contact with me. When it was time to serve cake, I stood up to help. I reached for a plastic knife, and gently began to slice one of the corners, hoping to serve the children first. That's when she swooped in, not violently but pointedly. "Oh, I've got it," she said with a clipped smile. "You can just relax." Her tone was sugar-coated steel. My hand froze mid-slice. I stepped back as she took the knife from me and handed it to her cousin, not even looking my way again. So I did what she asked. I sat back down. I let her pretend she was the only woman who'd ever known how to organize a celebration. I let her ignore the decades I'd spent doing the same for the very man she married, for the very boy blowing out those candles. The paper plates were passed down the table like offerings. I was handed one near the end, the smallest slice slightly crumbling at the edges, like I'd been an afterthought in the order of service. It sounds petty, I know, but it's in the smallest things always. The slice of cake, the glance skipped, the way your voice is the only one that doesn't echo back. Then came the photos. She held her phone high and gathered everyone into little clusters. Family picture, she called. Get the grandparents. Her parents came running, arms slung around each other like a holiday postcard. I stood waiting for her to turn to include me, to say, "Come stand here, right beside your grandson." But instead, she snapped one photo after another. I stayed just behind them, watching it all from a polite distance. After 5 minutes, I sat back down. My grandson saw me. He came over and sat in my lap with his plate of cake. "You didn't get a picture," he said, licking icing off his finger. "No," I replied, brushing his curls aside, "but I got to hold you. That's better." He smiled and leaned his head against my chest. He smelled like sugar and sunshine. For that moment alone, I was grateful I came, even if I felt like a misplaced relic in every other breath I took. The party stretched on with strained laughter and games in the backyard. I stepped outside briefly to watch them run through the grass, his little legs moving like the wind was carrying him. My son stood near the grill, laughing at something her uncle had said, but he looked older now, tired in ways I couldn't explain. He didn't laugh like he used to, with abandon. He laughed in short bursts, always scanning, like waiting for her reaction. I went back inside. The kitchen was now half clean, wiped down with military precision. I stood near the hallway, not really sure what to do. I watched her wipe down the counters, barking gentle orders to her sister. Her voice was all performance, like she wanted everyone to see how effortlessly she managed the show. But the warmth, it wasn't there. She wasn't hosting. She was controlling. And everyone fell in line except me, because I wasn't afraid of her, not the way they were. But that didn't mean I was welcome. That didn't mean I mattered. I found myself looking at the clock more than once. I didn't want to overstay. I didn't want to be the burden. But a grandmother should never have to calculate when to leave her grandson's party. That kind of sorrow lives in your bones. Just before I slipped away, I went to the counter and quietly placed the gift I'd brought into the stack with the others. She hadn't touched it all day. I watched her lean over and whisper to her sister, who picked it up and turned it over with a raised eyebrow. I don't know what they said. I don't need to. The expression on her face told me everything. They didn't want what I brought. Not the locket. Not the memory. Not me. So I walked back through the house, past the decorations, the laughter, the carefully arranged smiles, and I stepped out into the cool air where no one noticed I was gone. It happened so quickly I almost missed it. The moment that should have felt like a ribbon around a memory, one I could keep tucked inside my heart forever, came and went, like a breath I hadn't been allowed to finish. My grandson stood on a chair in front of the cake, 5 candles glowing against the backdrop of sugar and frosting, and everyone gathered around in a half-circle, phones, out voices raised in a slightly off-key chorus of happy birthday. I was still coming back in from the hallway. I had gone to the bathroom mostly to escape, just a few minutes to breathe, to pull myself together behind a locked door and a cracked window. I didn't expect the song to start so soon. I hurried in searching the crowd for a space to stand, but there wasn't one. They had arranged themselves so neatly, all her family clustered in close elbows, brushing wide grins on their faces. I stood at the edge just beyond the doorway, craning my neck to see him. He looked around once, maybe twice before the last line of the song faded. "Happy birthday, dear Charlie." And then he blew out the candles in one long gust. No one thought to ask where I was. No one said, "Let's wait for Grandma." No one turned. I just stood there, frozen in place, hands still damp from where I'd splashed water on my face. It was the first time I hadn't been beside him for that moment. Even as a baby, when he couldn't blow out candles himself, I was the one who held him near the cake, whispering wishes he couldn't yet speak. And now, I was just another body in the room, another background blur in their family album. The applause came quickly, followed by laughter and clinking forks. Her mother handed out cake slices like a master of ceremonies. Her cousin snapped another dozen photos. My son kissed the top of his child's head and then turned to whisper something in her ear. They laughed together. I watched the joy circle around them like a ribbon I wasn't tied into. I stood still. No one noticed. Or maybe they did and didn't care. Eventually, I walked forward and placed my hand softly on my grandson's back. "Happy birthday, sweetheart," I said, my voice softer than I meant it to be. He turned with a mouthful of cake and grinned. "Thank you, Grandma." Then he was gone again, swept into another game, another round of giggles in the other room. I was invisible, but not to him. That mattered, at least for now. They started opening presents in the living room. Everyone gathered around again. I hung back, half-shadowed by the hallway. My gift was still unopened. It had been placed off to the side, its ribbon slightly crooked from being handled too roughly. I watched as her side of the family brought out shiny boxes, things wrapped with precision, and ribbon that curled perfectly. Expensive toys, new clothes, flashy gadgets. Every gift met with exaggerated delight. "Oh, wow! That's amazing," and praise back to the giver. Mine sat untouched. I waited. Eventually, my son noticed it and handed it over. "This one's from Grandma," he said casually. The little silver box was unwrapped quickly, carelessly. The locket emerged delicate and small in his little hands. "What is it?" he asked, turning it over. "It opens," I offered, gently taking a step closer. "There's a picture of us inside from when you were a baby." He smiled as he opened it, and I caught the flicker of recognition in his eyes. "That's me." "Yes," I nodded. "You were only a few days old. I held you the whole afternoon. You fell asleep on my chest and wouldn't let go." He laughed. "I don't remember that." "I do," I whispered. And then she spoke. "It's sweet," she said from across the room, her voice dipped in something too polite to be kind. "But he's not really into jewelry. We'll just keep it in his memory box." Memory box, like a museum exhibit. She didn't even look at me when she said it. Something inside me shifted, not snapped. I wasn't the snapping kind, but something cooled, hardened, a kind of slow, steady retreat that began at my fingertips and traveled up through my arms, my shoulders, my neck. I nodded once and sat back down. I didn't speak for the rest of the gift opening. I just watched her mother beam with pride as her gift, a toy robot, got the loudest cheer. Watched her sister film the whole thing as if she were the family historian. Watched my son lean back against the couch, his eyes flicking toward me only once briefly and then away. After the last gift was unwrapped, they gathered for more photos. She posed them like a director children. Here parents, there, grandparents on this side, her side, always her side. She looked at me once, then gestured with her eyes toward the edge of the couch. "You can sit over there if you'd like," she said. Over there. Not beside him, not beside anyone. Just over there. So I did. I smiled for the camera, because I still had my dignity even if they didn't see it. I smiled not for them, but for the boy who once grabbed my finger with all 5 of his. I smiled for the woman I used to be, the one who gave her life to this family. I smiled because I knew they'd never be able to say I was unkind. But something inside me, something soft and warm, dimmed that day. Not dead, not gone, but dimmed, because he blew out those candles alone. And I'd never forget it. There are things you notice as a mother. Quiet things, subtle things that no one else sees. You notice when your child's voice changes, when the laugh you used to hear from the next room softens, shortens, becomes something more measured. You notice the pause before they speak, the glance they throw across the room to someone else, as if asking permission to have their own thoughts. That's what I saw that day, and every day after she came into our lives, my son looking to her before deciding who he could be. She took him with her eyes, not suddenly, not all at once. It was a slow theft, a silent one. The kind that happens in small conversations and private glances and decisions made when no one else is watching. I watched it unfold like fog rolling into a field gradually, then all at once everything was swallowed. It started with how he stood. He used to carry himself like the house was his grounded, relaxed warm, but now he hovered, like he was in someone else's space. His shoulders tightened whenever she entered the room. His voice dropped when she was near. He didn't sit beside me anymore. He sat beside her. And when she moved, he moved. I remember a moment at the party just after the candles were blown out and the cake had been served. My son walked into the kitchen to grab something. I don't even remember what, and I followed, hoping to steal a quiet word. I reached out, touched his arm gently. "Everything okay?" I asked. He looked at me startled, like I'd broken through a surface he wasn't expecting. "Yeah, Mom. Everything's great," he said quickly. Too quickly. Then over my shoulder, his eyes shifted to her. She had just entered behind me, her arms folded, watching. He stepped back. I should get back out there. That glance was all it took. He was hers again. I turned and caught her expression, not angry, not even smug, just satisfied, like watching a trained dog return to heel. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. He hadn't always been this way. He used to call me every Sunday just to chat. We'd talk about nothing for an hour, recipes, weather, memories. He used to ask for my advice, about work, about life, about love. But after she came along, the calls grew shorter, then fewer, then gone altogether. I used to think it was just the natural growing space of marriage, of starting a family. But I started to see it for what it was: curated distance, controlled detachment. I remember one Thanksgiving when he said they were going to her parents' house instead. I'd spent days preparing pies, turkey stuffing, all the dishes he grew up loving. He called me the night before and said, "She really wants to be with her side this year. Hope that's okay." It wasn't, but I said it was. That's what mothers do. We swallow things, big things, and smile so our children don't see the storm in our stomachs. He used to hug me like he meant it, long, firm, like he was anchoring himself. Now his hugs felt more like greetings at a job interview, polite, brief, forgettable. At the party, I watched him pour her a drink, then hand it to her without even asking. She didn't say thank you. just took it. And when she saw me watching, she raised the glass slightly as if to toast me, but her eyes were empty. I sat back down, folding my hands in my lap to keep them from trembling, not out of anger, not even sadness, not yet, but out of that creeping clarity that comes when you've finally named what's happening to you. She wasn't trying to join our family. She was trying to replace it. And she had started by changing the man I raised. He still looked like my son, still had his warm brown eyes and gentle smile. But there was something missing, a light behind his gaze that used to be there when he was around me. He still loved me, I believed that, but his love had been filtered, edited, made safe for her approval. She held him like a leash, not tight, not choking, just firm enough to keep him from wandering too far into who he used to be. And he didn't even realize it. That night, as the party wound down and people began to gather their things, I stood beside the door waiting to say goodbye. He came over to hug me like he was fulfilling a social obligation. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said, brushing my shoulder. I looked into his face, and I said softly, "I miss you." He blinked. "I'm right here." "No," I replied. "You're not." He opened his mouth to say something, but then she appeared beside him, slipping her arm through his, pulling him back toward the guests. And just like that, he was gone again. The door closed behind me, and I stood on the porch alone, holding the weight of every memory where he had once reached for me and didn't. I carried it with me carefully, a small silver box wrapped in soft cream paper tied with a blue ribbon I'd ironed myself. Inside was the locket, delicate oval, polished to a gentle shine, and tucked within it a photo of the day he was born. His eyes shut tight, fists curled like little knots, a tiny pink cap on his head. I was holding him in that photo. You could see my eyes in it, tired, yes, but alight with something sacred. I had kept that photo tucked in my wallet for years, but this year I thought, maybe it was time to pass it down. He was turning 5, the age when memories start to stick. I wanted him to have something real, not plastic, not flashing, not made by machines. Something from the marrow of our family, a piece of us. I watched the way he unwrapped the gift's brightly colored boxes from every direction. Toys with remote controls singing dinosaurs, giant puzzles he'd never finish, but would scatter across the floor for weeks. Laughter followed every crinkling of paper. Every gift got an ooh and a wow. Cameras flashed. Her sister narrated it all like a game show host. When it came time for mine, the room fell quieter, not in anticipation, but in something closer to apathy. My son handed it over without fanfare. "This one's from Grandma," he said, his voice as plain as the wallpaper behind him. My grandson peeled away the ribbon with chubby fingers. He lifted the box lid, revealing the velvet pouch inside. I saw his eyes go wide with curiosity. He pulled the locket out gently, turning it over in his palms. "It opens," I said softly from my seat. "There's a picture inside." He clicked it open. I watched his eyes search it, that tiny face of his flickering between confusion and fascination. "That's me?" he asked. I smiled. "That's you. Just hours old. You were wrapped up in a blanket, and I didn't want to put you down." He looked at it for a moment longer. Then he nodded and said, "Cool," before setting it down beside a pile of wrapping paper. She was standing behind him. Her arms were crossed, her mouth twisted in the faintest line, not quite a frown, not quite a smile, just enough for me to see what she thought of it. Then came the glance. She picked up the locket, turned it over in her fingers like it was a coin from a foreign country. "It's very nostalgic," she said. Her tone dipped in that brand of politeness that isn't kind at all. probably more of a keepsake than a toy. We'll find a place to store it, don't worry. Store it. Like it was clutter. I felt heat rise in my chest, but I said nothing. I didn't want to make a scene. I just watched as she handed the locket to her sister, who slipped it into a side drawer with the napkins and party favors, as if that little piece of our history could be folded up and filed away like it meant nothing at all. My son didn't say a word. He didn't pick it up again. He didn't thank me. He just helped his wife tidy up the wrapping paper while the other kids tore into cupcakes. I thought of all the gifts I'd given over the years, tiny, thoughtful ones. My grandmother's hairbrush passed down to my daughter, a quilt I spent months stitching, a cookbook with annotations in the margins telling stories between the recipes. I thought love meant handing things down. I thought love meant memory. But that day, love looked like a forgotten trinket left on a kitchen counter, wiped away with the crumbs. Later, when things had calmed, I saw my grandson again. He came to sit beside me with a dinosaur in one hand and frosting on his cheek. "Grandma," he said, "can I play outside?" "Of course," I said, brushing the hair from his forehead. "Just make sure you wear shoes." He giggled. "I like the picture. Can I see it again sometime?" That was all I needed, just that. One sentence of recognition from the only soul in that house who hadn't been trained to ignore me. Still, as I helped him slip his sneakers on by the door, I saw her watching us again. Not with affection, not with interest, just with that look, like she was measuring how much space I was taking up, as if I were a guest who had overstayed. I stood up and gave my grandson a little pat on the back. He ran outside into the warm afternoon sun, and I leaned against the wall, letting the silence settle into my skin. I thought about how many birthdays I'd organized in my life, how many cakes I'd baked from scratch, how many party hats I'd folded, how many candles I'd lit while whispering wishes into the flickering flames. I thought about all the hours I'd spent building memories so my son would grow up knowing what love looked like. And now here I was, just a shadow at the edge of a party, my gift set aside, my place barely acknowledged. I didn't need applause. I didn't need spectacle. But I deserved something more than a cold glance. By late afternoon, the party had lost its rhythm. The kids were sugar-drunk and muddy-kneed, their screams echoing from the backyard as they played tag in crooked circles. The adults had migrated into little social islands, her mother and her friends at the kitchen table sipping wine from stemless glasses, her father and uncle standing near the barbecue talking about stocks and sports. Everyone had a place. Everyone except me. I sat on the living room couch alone, like a side table, in a house no longer mine. I'd chosen the corner seat, the one with the faded cushion that dipped a little too low. I didn't mind. Corners are safe places. You can see everything from a corner, even when no one sees you. They moved around me like I wasn't there. Her sister stepped over my feet twice without an apology, balancing a tray of cupcakes. Her cousin dropped her jacket next to me on the cushion, never once acknowledging my presence. I wasn't offended. I wasn't even surprised anymore. I was background, like wallpaper you forget to replace. A fixture. A woman sat beside me briefly, one of her aunts, I think, and scrolled silently on her phone. Then after a moment, she looked up, squinted like she wasn't sure who I was, and asked, "Oh, are you from her side, or—" I turned slowly. "I'm his mother." She blinked. "Oh, right, of course, sorry." Then she stood and walked away. My son passed by minutes later, a half smile on his face, holding a tub of toys. "Hey, Mom," he said lightly, as if I hadn't been sitting in the same spot for almost an hour. I nodded. "Need help?" No, you just relax. That same phrase again. You just relax. It's what people say when they don't want to include you, but also don't want to feel guilty for excluding you. I leaned back, let my fingers graze the frayed seam of the pillow beside me. I stared at the mantel where new family photos had been arranged since my last visit. Her family's faces filled the frames, one after another, matching sweaters, vacation smiles. It was like a museum of curated perfection. No room for anything older, anything real. There had once been a photo of my son in a Halloween costume I made by hand, a cardboard robot with aluminum foil arms. It used to sit right there beside the clock, now gone. They were scrubbing me out picture by picture, memory by memory. I thought about the last time they had dinner at my house. A year ago, maybe more. I'd made roast chicken green beans with caramelized onions, the peach cobbler he used to beg for when he was 10. They arrived late. She barely touched the food, said she was cutting carbs. He said nothing. When they left, she thanked me in that clipped way. "So nice of you to cook." He kissed my cheek out of habit. And that was that. It's strange the way a woman can be replaced, not all at once, but over time slowly erased by someone with a sharper voice and a shorter memory. Her presence was like water wearing down stone, a casual reordering of things whose name was remembered first, whose recipe was served at Christmas, who sat beside the child in every photo. I looked out the window and saw my grandson chasing a balloon across the grass, his giggle light as air. I smiled. At least that hadn't changed yet, but I knew she was already shaping how he would remember me, what he would carry, what he wouldn't. I'd heard from a neighbor that she was looking into private schools, ones near her family's neighborhood, ones with no mention of us. Inside, the laughter swelled again, sharp and bright, like champagne fizz. I looked toward the kitchen. Her mother had opened a second bottle of wine and was pouring generously mid-story. The others leaned in close, hungry for her next punchline. They laughed the kind of laugh that closes a circle that marks who's inside and who's not. I sat still. I didn't want their wine. I wanted my place back. I wanted to feel like I belonged in my own family. But families, I've come to realize, can be redesigned not with love or loss, but with preference. And preference, when left unchecked, becomes erasure. I stood up, my knees stiff, and walked toward the hallway. I passed them without a word. No one noticed. I washed my hands in the bathroom, stared at my reflection. My lipstick had faded. My eyes looked tired. But I still knew who I was. I still remembered everything I'd built. When I came back out, I saw them taking a group photo near the cake. Her parents, her sister, her friends. My son was smiling in the middle of them, one arm around his wife, the other resting near her mother's shoulder. I wasn't asked to join. I didn't interrupt. I stood behind the doorway and watched. They looked like a Christmas card, like I'd never existed. And in that moment I realized something painful but freeing. I was no longer part of their idea of family. Not really. I was furniture. Well-placed, useful once, but quietly in the way now. So I returned to my corner of the couch, and I stopped trying to be noticed. The sun was starting to dip behind the trees by the time I slipped out. I didn't wait for a big goodbye. I didn't gather anyone or make an announcement. I just found my purse, checked one last time for the locket, still in that drawer by the napkin, still forgotten, and walked out the front door with as much grace as I could summon. No one followed. No one called after me. I got in my car and sat there for a few minutes watching the house. Through the front window I could still see them laughing. The party hadn't paused for my absence. It hadn't even blinked. It went on bright and clean and curated without the woman who helped raise the very man they were celebrating around. I placed my hands on the steering wheel and noticed the tremble. It wasn't anger. It was something softer, more fragile, like grief. But not for a death, for a fading, for something once vivid and beloved that was now worn so thin I could see through it. My hand hovered over the ignition, but I didn't turn the key. Not right away. I just sat there, breathing, blinking through a sting in my eyes. I refused to call tears. The silence in the car was heavy, thick with things unsaid. I thought of all the ways I'd tried to hold on, all the times I'd bit my tongue when she corrected me in front of others, or rearranged plans without telling me, or took credit for things I had quietly done in the background. I thought of how often I'd told myself, she's just young, she's overwhelmed, she'll come around. But year after year, the door closed tighter, and I stood on the porch holding casseroles and birthday cards, hoping the next knock would finally be answered with warmth. It never was. I turned the key and the engine hummed to life. I pulled away slowly, the balloons on the lawn shrinking in my rearview mirror. My hands gripped the wheel harder than they needed to. My chest felt like it held something trapped, a sound I hadn't let escape. The kind of cry you don't want anyone to hear because once it's out, you can't take it back. I turned onto the main road. The streets were quiet Sunday afternoon, winding down. I passed the park where I used to take my son when he was small. He loved the swings best, not because of the thrill, but because he trusted me to push him to catch him. He used to throw his head back and laugh his arms wide, shouting, "Higher, Mama." And I always did. I always pushed him higher. I don't know when he stopped trusting me like that. I don't know when my push became a threat instead of support. Maybe when she arrived. Maybe before. Maybe I'll never know. The tears came then, not in a wave, but in quiet slips. They slid down my cheeks as I turned onto my street. The houses familiar but suddenly strange. Everything felt different. The whole world felt tilted, as if I had stepped out of one life and into another without realizing it. I pulled into my driveway and sat with the engine off, the key still in my hand, the silence wrapping around me like a shroud. My porch light flickered on, sensing movement. I stared at it, that small artificial star, thinking how welcoming it looked, how much warmer it was than any light in their home. Inside the house greeted me with stillness. No voices, no noise, just the faint scent of lemon from the candle I'd left burning in a shallow dish. I set my purse down, kicked off my shoes, let the coat fall from my shoulders and land where it may. I moved through the rooms like a woman returning from battle, unarmed, uncelebrated. In the kitchen, I poured myself a cup of tea. I didn't boil new water, just reheated what had been left in the kettle, old warmth for old sorrow. I sat at the table and stared at the empty seat across from me. For years, I'd kept that chair ready for visits, for impromptu lunches, for sleepy grandchildren trailing crumbs. But today, that chair felt like a tombstone, a memory of what might have been. I opened my notebook, the one I keep in the drawer with the half-used pens and the birthday cards I never sent. I wrote one sentence. I was not invisible. They simply chose not to see me. And as I wrote it, my hand stopped shaking. There was a steadiness in naming it, in no longer pretending, in finally admitting that I wasn't just feeling left out. I had been pushed out, slowly, methodically, replaced. I sipped my tea. It was bitter, but it was real. And that was more than I could say for the sweetness they offered me. There are drawers in my home that I open only when I need to remember who I used to be, who I still am beneath the dust of all these quiet betrayals. In one of them, tucked between faded greeting cards and bits of ribbon too pretty to throw away, there's a bundle of letters, all addressed to my son, none of them ever mailed. I started writing them the first year after he got married, not for any dramatic reason, not because there was some big fight, just because I started noticing his voice on the phone changing, a hesitancy, a space between his words where there used to be warmth. I wanted to tell him everything I was feeling, but I didn't want to burden him, so I put it on paper instead. The first one was gentle. I wrote about how proud I was, how beautiful the wedding had been. how happy I was that he found someone to love. I remember finishing that letter with tears in my eyes, not from sadness, just from the weight of all the years that had brought us there. That version of me still believed I'd be part of their new life, not just a relic of the old one. The letters after that changed. Not quickly, not angrily, but gradually, like the seasons shifting. I began writing down the little things, how she'd schedule visits without asking if I was available, how they skipped Thanksgiving one year with barely a phone call, how I always seemed to be invited only after her family had already RSVP'd. I didn't send those letters because I didn't want to seem bitter. I didn't want him to think I was jealous. I wasn't. I just missed my son. One letter was about the time they came to dinner, and she brought her own food, a salad in a plastic container. She said she didn't eat heavy meals. My roast, chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans with butter. She called them comfort food, like it was a bad thing. I watched him eat quietly, nodding, not defending the food he once called his favorite. Another letter was about my grandson's first preschool play. I wasn't invited. I saw pictures later, his chubby cheeks painted like a lion, his arms stretched wide on stage. I cried alone at the kitchen table, clutching a printed photo I found on a cousin's social media post. I wrote about that in ink, too, told him how proud I was, told him I wished I'd been there. Then I folded the letter and placed it in the drawer with the rest. Dozens of them now. Pages and pages of quiet grief. But also love. Always love. Because even in my loneliness, I never stopped loving him. That's the cruel irony of motherhood. Even when they disappear, you still keep a plate warm for them just in case. Some nights I'd sit at that little writing desk, the lamp casting a soft circle of light, and I'd reread them. Sometimes I'd laugh at how careful I tried to be, how I edited myself down to keep the peace. Other times I'd cry because the peace never came anyway. One letter written just 2 months before that birthday party was the most honest of them all. In it, I finally wrote the words I'd never said aloud. She doesn't want me in your life. Not really. She lets me in when it's convenient, when there's a chair to fill or a photo to balance. But I see the truth. I see how your eyes check hers before you speak. I see how you shrink when she's near, and how you let her decide who matters. I just wish for once you would choose me too. I didn't sign that one. I couldn't. Because I was afraid of what it meant to tell him that truth. Afraid that maybe he had chosen, and I just didn't want to see it. After the party, after the silence in the car and the bitter tea at the table, I opened that drawer again. I read the letters one by one like prayers left unanswered. My handwriting changed across the pages, sloping in some tight and clenched in others. You could trace my heartbreak just by following the curve of my S. I thought about sending them all, stuffing them into one heavy envelope, letting him feel the full weight of everything he hadn't noticed. But I didn't. Not because he didn't deserve the truth, but because I knew he wouldn't hear it. Not yet. And I wasn't ready to hand her my pain like a weapon, because that's what she would do with it. She would use my words to paint me as dramatic, needy, emotional, all the things she already hinted I was. I could hear her voice in my head. She's just trying to make you feel guilty again. But guilt isn't what I wanted. I just wanted to be seen. I closed the drawer. The letters would stay a little longer, not forever. Just until I decided who I was writing them for, him or me. Because maybe after all this time, they weren't really for him at all. Maybe they were how I remembered myself. My voice, my pain, my truth. And in a house where no one listens, that kind of remembering is everything. There's a corner of my backyard where the roses grow wild. I never meant for them to. They were supposed to stay in neat rows, trimmed and guided, kept in their place. But they had other ideas. They reached and twisted and tangled into each other until they formed something both unruly and strangely beautiful. I used to fight them. I'd prune them back with determined hands, trying to force them into shapes that made sense. But over time I gave in. Let them have their way. They weren't meant to be controlled. They were meant to be free. Much like me, I've come to realize. After the birthday party, I spent more time in that garden, morning and evening, sometimes in the heat of the day when the world felt too loud. I'd crouch beside the thorns, gloved and quiet, talking to no one, but also talking to everything. The garden listened. The earth didn't ask me to smile. The roses didn't require me to be soft or small. I whispered things to them I couldn't say aloud, like how I felt erased, like how I missed my son, like how it hurt to still love people who no longer made space for you. There was a moment early spring, a week or two after the party, when I found a single blossom broken at the stem. Torn down by wind or some careless bird, I picked it up and turned it over in my hands. It was still beautiful, still full of color, still fragrant. But it had no roots. It wouldn't survive now. It would wither no matter how lovely it looked. That's how I felt. Still blooming, yes, but slowly being pulled from the soil I'd called home for decades. I knelt beside the bushes and began to trim. Not out of frustration, but ceremony. Each snip of my shears was a release. Every faded bloom that fell to the ground was something I didn't need to carry anymore. The unspoken birthday wishes, the invitations that never came, the smiles that never reached the eyes. I thought of the time I offered to host Thanksgiving, and she replied, "We already made other plans," before I'd even finished my sentence. I thought of how she once referred to me as his side of the family, like I was an optional attachment. I thought of the way she took over every conversation, always steering things back to her achievements, her ideas, her family. I whispered all of this to the roses. "I see what she's doing," I said one morning, kneeling in the dirt. "She's replanting my son in a garden where I'm not welcome." The wind rustled through the leaves, as if it agreed. And yet he wasn't hers to steal. Not entirely. I had raised him. I had held him when he was feverish and small. I had taught him to spell his name, to ride a bike, to apologize when he hurt someone. I had stitched him into the fabric of my life, every thread wound with intention and love. I could feel myself letting go of something with each breath I took in that garden. Not my son, but the version of him I kept hoping would return, the one untouched by her edits, the one who looked at me without apology in his eyes. He might still be in there, somewhere, but I no longer had the key to bring him out. One day, as I watered the roots in the early evening light, I looked up at the sky and felt something like peace, not because anything had changed, but because I had finally stopped waiting for it to. That's when I began to think about what I had control over, not him, not her, not the invitations or the photos or the seat at the table I was never offered. But I did have control over my choices, my legacy, my will. It started as a whisper, a passing thought. Then, like the roses, it grew, twisting around my heart, wrapping itself into something fierce. If they couldn't see my worth now, maybe they'd feel it later in the quiet absence of everything they assumed would one day be theirs. I walked back into the house that evening with dirt on my knees and fire in my spine. I wasn't going to fight with her anymore. I wasn't going to beg for his attention. I wasn't going to write another letter or wait for another forgotten invitation. I was going to make the kind of decision you don't have to speak aloud, the kind that rewrites a future. The the kind that doesn't require a raised voice, just a signed name. But before that, I'd spend a few more mornings with my roses, because they at least never looked away. I didn't plan to say anything, not that day, not in that way. But sometimes the silence becomes too loud to bear. It presses in on your ribs, spills out between your teeth, finds its way into the room whether you mean for it to or not. That afternoon, my son came by alone for once. She was away on some weekend retreat with her mother. It had been ages since we'd sat across from each other like that, just the two of us in the kitchen where I used to pour his cereal and tie his shoelaces and listen to him tell stories about imaginary dragons. We were drinking coffee, mine black, his, with too much cream. I still remembered how he liked it. I always remembered. He told me about work, about how busy things had been, how hard he was trying to balance everything. I nodded, listened, waited. Then I said softly, "Do you ever miss how things used to be?" He looked up. "What do you mean?" "I mean us," I replied. "You and me. The way we used to talk, the way we used to laugh, without watching the door." He frowned. "Mom." I'm not trying to start anything, I said quickly. I'm just tired of pretending everything's fine. He set his cup down. "It is fine." "No," I said, my voice trembling a little. "It's not. I come to your house and feel like a stranger. I sit in your living room like a guest nobody asked for. I bring gifts that get shoved in drawers. I smile through parties where no one speaks to me. And you," I paused, swallowing the lump in my throat. "You let it happen." His face changed, tightened. "You're reading too much into things." "No," I said again. "I'm finally seeing them clearly." He leaned back in his chair and crossed his arms. "You're being dramatic." That word, dramatic, it landed like a slap, not for its volume, but its weight, the dismissal in it, the way it erased everything I'd just said, years of quiet sacrifice, of shrinking myself to fit into corners she'd left for me. "I'm not dramatic," I whispered. He sighed. "You're emotional, sensitive. You've always taken things too personally." "Because they are personal," I said, firmer now. "When you stop inviting me to your son's school events, that's personal. When your wife treats me like a nuisance instead of a mother, that's personal. When you let her rewrite the shape of our family and expect me to nod along, that's personal." He looked away. He didn't have a reply. Or maybe he did, but not one he was willing to say. I stood up suddenly, feeling like I couldn't sit still anymore. I walked to the sink and looked out the window at the garden. The roses were blooming again, bold and defiant. "Do you remember I asked how you used to beg me to come to your baseball games, even when I was working late? How you'd cry when I wasn't in the stands?" He nodded slowly. "Well," I said, my voice catching, "that's how I feel now. Like I'm looking for you in the crowd, and you're not even waving." There was a long silence between us, the kind that fills a room to its edges. Then he spoke, quiet but firm. "I'm doing my best, Mom. I'm trying to keep peace, to balance things." "Peace," I echoed, "at the cost of your mother." He flinched, but didn't deny it. I turned around and walked back toward him. "I don't need you to choose sides," I said. "I need you to remember I exist, that I mattered long before she did, that you don't have to erase me to love her." He looked like he might say something, but again, nothing. And I knew then that he wasn't going to fight for me. Not because he didn't love me, but because loving her came with rules, and one of those rules was pretending I was the problem. I sat down again and folded my hands in my lap. My voice was softer now, steadier. "I'm not asking you to fix anything. I've already made peace with the way things are. I just needed you to know. I see it, all of it, and it hurts." He nodded once, a small barely there motion. And that was the end of it. He left not long after with a quiet hug that felt more like an apology he couldn't put into words. I didn't cry. Not that night. I just sat with the quiet for a long time, listening to the way the wind moved through the trees outside, listening to the echo of dramatic in my mind over and over again, until it lost its power. Because I knew the truth. I wasn't being dramatic. I was being honest. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't care if he liked it. It wasn't a decision I made in a moment of anger. No slammed doors, no shaking fists, just a quiet clarity like a fog lifting after years of pretending it wasn't there. I woke up one morning, brewed my tea, stood at the kitchen window watching dew drip from the leaves in my garden, and said aloud to no one, to everyone, I'm done. Done hoping they'd come around. Done twisting myself into whatever version of a mother or grandmother they found most convenient. Done letting silence be mistaken for consent. They had built a life where I was tolerated, not loved, invited but not embraced, preserved like an antique vase displayed, never used. I pulled out the old manila folder where I kept my will. It had been years since I looked at it. Dust gathered on the edges. Inside, everything was still as I left it. My son listed as the sole beneficiary. A few sentences about family heirlooms and what I hoped would be remembered. I read it all once, then again. And each time I saw his name, a hollow opened in my chest. This boy, this man I raised, would inherit everything I'd built. The house, the savings, the jewelry box with his grandmother's gold ring, and yet he couldn't even make space for me in a birthday photo. He couldn't speak up when I was belittled in his own living room. He couldn't even say I miss you without looking to her for approval. I closed the folder and pressed it to my chest. My heart was steady. There was no rage, just grief. A slow-burning grief that had aged into wisdom. Later that week, I called my lawyer. Old friend, sharp as ever, voice crisp through the phone. It's time, I told him. I'd like to make some changes. He didn't ask why. He didn't need to. He'd known me long enough to hear the shift in my voice. We scheduled a meeting for Thursday. I arrived early, wearing my best blouse and carrying a tote bag with notes I'd scribbled late into the night. Names, ideas, charities, people who had actually been there for me when the world grew quiet. We sat in his office, the room lined with leather-bound books and framed certificates, the windows let in soft morning light. I handed him my old will. I want to start over, I said. He nodded, slid on his reading glasses, and listened. I still love my son, I began. I always will. But love and inheritance are not the same thing. I've spent my life saving, building, planning, and I want what I've built to go to people who see me, who value me, not people who roll their eyes when I speak, not people who whisper about how irrelevant I've become. I named a few distant relatives who'd always visited with warmth, a neighbor who shoveled my driveway without being asked, the nurse who brought me books and sat with me when I had the flu last winter, the one who held my hand and called me family, even though she wasn't required to. I want her to have the house, I said, tears in my eyes. She made it feel warm again. My lawyer looked up. You're sure? Yes, I replied. For the first time in a long time, I'm completely sure. We went line by line. I changed beneficiaries. Removed my son from the primary clause, left him a few small items, things with meaning, not value. A photograph of us from when he was 12. A letter I'd written the day he graduated college. I wanted him to have something, yes, but not everything. Not what he'd already decided I was too much of a burden to earn. When we reached the section about personal effects, I paused. What about the locket, my lawyer asked. I smiled faintly. I'll decide where it goes later, I said. but not to someone who can't see the weight it carries. We finalized the draft. I signed it with a steady hand. The ink flowed smoothly dark and permanent. I felt no hesitation. Walking out of that office, I expected to feel guilt. I waited for it to rise in my chest, twist in my stomach, whisper in my ear that I was being petty or cruel. But it never came. What came instead was relief. Like I'd finally stood up for myself in a conversation I'd been too polite to participate in for far too long. They had written me out of their lives one cold glance at a time. I had simply returned the favor one clean signature at a time. Later that evening, I stood in my garden again. The wind was soft. The roses bent slightly in the breeze, not breaking, just bowing. I touched the petals and thought of legacy, of what we leave behind. I had always believed that love would be enough. But now I knew dignity must come first. The next year, when his birthday rolled around again, I sat at my kitchen table with the same stack of colored envelopes I always kept in the drawer. I used to choose the brightest one, something with stars or glitter, something that stood out in the pile. This time I chose a plain white card. No balloons, no dinosaurs. Just simple, quiet paper. Like a whisper, not a shout. The birthday party was never mentioned to me. No text, no call, no invitation. But I saw the photos, of course. Social media is a cruel kind of window, one you're never asked to look through, but that always seems to be open. There they were, again the same smiles, the same curated perfection. Her family in full lined up like royalty. My son with his hand resting on her mother's shoulder, and my grandson right in the middle blowing out 7 candles. 7. I hadn't seen him in almost 5 months. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, zooming in on faces that no longer looked for mine. Then I closed the laptop, and I opened the card. I didn't want to write something performative, no cheerful lies, no hollow platitudes, so I wrote the truth wrapped in love and sealed in grace. Happy birthday, sweetheart. I hope today is full of laughter and cake and friends who make you feel big and brave and free. I miss you every day, even the quiet ones. I hope you keep the locket somewhere safe. It holds more than a photo. It holds a piece of my heart. Love always, Grandma. Then just below my signature, I added one more line. Not for him, not really. He was too young to understand. But someday, maybe he'd read it again. Some goodbyes don't come with shouting, just space. I placed the card in the envelope and affixed a stamp with trembling fingers, not because I was nervous, but because this was the first time in my life that mailing a birthday card felt like closing a door instead of opening one. I walked it to the mailbox myself, took the long way down the drive, breathing in the scent of damp earth and trimmed grass. The mailbox creaked when I opened it, and I slid the card inside gently like laying something to rest. When the lid closed, it echoed soft final. That was the last gift I gave them. And not just to my grandson, to all of them. No more showing up for parties I wasn't welcome at. No more bringing food they wouldn't eat. No more sitting in the corner of a house I used to feel at home in. I was done offering pieces of myself to people who treated love like clutter. Later that night, I lit a candle in the kitchen lavender, his favorite scent from when he was small. I sipped my tea and sat with the stillness. No voice asked where I was. No child tugged on my sleeve. But I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. I felt peace. Not the peace that comes from resolution, but the peace that comes when you stop begging for someone to value what you've already freely given. I let the tears come this time, let them run freely without shame. They weren't angry tears, they were tired ones, tears that came from years of soft disappointments, from birthdays missed, not because of distance, but because of design, from the quiet erosion of connection, one unspoken slight at a time. I didn't know if he'd read the card. I didn't know if she'd let him. I didn't know if he still kept the locket, or if it had been discarded, buried under plastic toys and unwanted things. But I knew I had said what I needed to say. I had spoken finally in my own voice. Not filtered, not trimmed for politeness, just truth wrapped in love and sealed with dignity. That was my goodbye. Not a loud one, not a fight. Just a simple card dropped into a quiet mailbox followed by silence. And in that silence, I began to hear myself again. There's this myth we carry that family is everything, that no matter what happens, no matter how far we drift, or how deeply we wound each other, blood will pull us back together like a tide that never forgets the moon. I used to believe that. I really did. I built my entire life around it. Every sacrifice, every second job, every burnt dinner and sleepless night, all of it was rooted in this unshakable belief that family was a forever kind of thing, that it was unbreakable. But forever, I've learned, has loopholes. And not all families are chosen well. That doesn't mean I regret loving them, loving him. Of course I don't. How could I regret the boy who once fell asleep with his hand in mine, or the laughter we shared building pillow forts in the living room, or the sound of his feet running down the hallway just because he couldn't wait to show me something? But somewhere along the way, my love stopped being enough to earn me a seat at their table, not because I failed them, but because I no longer fit their idea of what belonged. I became inconvenient, outdated, sentimental in a world that prefers new and curated and silent. So I stopped knocking at the door, and instead I built a new one. My days now are quieter, my mornings slower. I wake when I want not to, the buzz of obligation, but to the hum of birds outside my window and the warmth of sunlight on my skin. I water my garden. I speak aloud to the roses. I smile at the nurse who stops by with warm eyes and gentle hands. We share stories over coffee. She tells me I remind her of her mother, and when she hugs me goodbye, it feels real. The inheritance I once imagined passing down like a torch, the house, the savings, the heirlooms now rests in hands that will carry it with care, not entitlement. People who didn't ask for anything, but gave me everything I hadn't realized I was starving for: respect, gentleness, time. I still think of them, my son, my grandson, always. Love doesn't just vanish because it wasn't returned. It lingers. It glows faintly, like a candle burning low in a window that no one looks through anymore. Some nights I stand at that window and whisper goodnight, not expecting an echo, just because I still mean it. But I don't ache for them like I used to, because I understand now I wasn't the one who left. I was left. And there's a difference. They chose their story. I chose mine. And mine, though quieter, smaller, is honest. I am no longer a performance for someone else's comfort. I am no longer trying to be tolerated. I am fully myself, and in that I have found something rarer than approval. I have found peace. In the end, it wasn't the will that gave me closure. It wasn't the silence or even the card I sent. It was the realization that I don't have to keep giving to people who only take. That love, while unconditional in its birth, must be mutual in its keeping. That sometimes the truest kind of power comes not from fighting to be included, but from walking away with your head held high. I used to think silence was punishment. Now I know it's preservation. They may never understand what they lost, but I know what I saved. Me. The days stretch out softer now, not empty, just wider, like the space after a long exhale where the noise finally fades and the body remembers what it's like to be still. I spend more time near the window watching shadows move across the floor. There's comfort in that kind of quiet. No voices to hush, no looks to interpret, no invitations to wait for. Just breath, just light. I've learned not to chase the kind of love that makes me feel like an obligation. I've learned that it's okay to close a door if the hallway on the other side only ever leads to hurt. I've learned that growing older doesn't mean fading. It means refining, shedding the layers that no longer serve you, keeping only the parts that feel like home. And maybe in some small, strange way, that was always the point. To remember who I am, without needing their mirror to reflect me. To speak my truth, without waiting for permission. To plant new things, friendships, routines, joy, and water them with the time and attention I used to give away so easily. I didn't need to raise my voice. I just needed to remember my worth. Some endings are just beginnings with the noise turned off. And I've never heard myself more clearly.